Hello, friends. It's been a long while since I made a video like this, more of a video log than writing, which I've been doing of late. Uh, but I had some things to say that just felt like they would be more true or more whole if I could say them with the fullness of my presence as opposed to writing, which to me is always kind of seeing someone through a screen or through a filter more so. So, yeah, I wanted to do one of these again. Just a technical thing. I used to rent cameras from UW-Madison, and so uh, I could set it up on a tripod in front of me, and that way I wouldn't have to worry about the camera during the actual filming and could really get into the zone. But now, like most people, I'm holding a cell phone with my hands, so it's a little more challenging, and it might be shaky, and I might have to change hands from time to time. But anyway, that's probably more my anxiety than anyone else's. So, like many people, I'm sure, I've been having not so much difficulty sleeping the past few nights as I've just been up thinking and feeling a lot during those nights. Uh, Difficulty sleeping, I think, often denotes like there's something wrong with the condition and I should just sleep through the night. But in this case, these thoughts and feelings, I think, are very powerful and present and necessary. And I'm thankful to be having them. I don't consider it a problem. I don't consider it an error that I'm awake at night thinking and feeling. And in fact, last night I was really thinking about some of the content that I want to share today, and I almost couldn't wait this morning. I got breakfast and did a yoga class, and the whole time I was like, when is this going to be over so I can share what I've been thinking about. Uh yeah. And so really what it is to me is an awakening. And I don't use that word lightly, but it is something that I've experienced a number of times in my life. And so at this point, I can kind of identify the patterns and say, oh, this is an awakening taking place. And this time it's an awakening around the topic of race, of course, because this past week, yet again, a black man was brutally and openly murdered by white police officers. And I say yet again because, upon reflecting upon this event and so many others like it, I realized that this kind of phenomenon has been present my entire lifetime. I did some writing on my Facebook page about this reflection, and I realized I don't know, look up Rodney King if you're too young to remember, but Rodney King's police beating, that instance of police brutality, took place shortly before I was born. And I was born in California and lived in LA. And the officer's acquittal took place just before my first birthday. And so my first birthday in 1992 actually took place during the LA riots. And of course, I don't remember this, but I've been told that we were hidden away inside the house and afraid of going outside because so much of the city was being destroyed in this wave of violence. And it's interesting to reflect too that the similarity here is that it was a citizen with a camera who happened to catch the brutality taking place with Rodney King and then shared it with a news station. The difference is back then it was a camera just for that purpose. People didn't have cell phones yet. And, the film actually had to be edited and transferred, and all of these long, centralized and hierarchical processes. Nowadays, we all have cameras in our hands, and we can upload video and share it to the world instantaneously. And so it's not as though this phenomenon is new or is happening more frequently. It's that people are better able to catch it in the moment, and it's easier, it's more accessible to share it widely. And so we're more aware of what, again, has been happening my entire lifetime. And as we know, and as I also wrote on my Facebook page, it's been happening for long before that. And it's indubitable to me that there are so many more instances than we will ever know, even today, even with the ubiquity of the surveillance that we all have in our pockets. We have never, and we will never, capture the immensity of the injustice taking place. And that injustice has been constant, again, since before my birth. And so I say I've been having an awakening around this, and I mean a few things by that. I want to talk about what an awakening is. An awakening for me is when we identify a pattern, identify that pattern denotes a choice, and through those recognitions, we become aware that another choice is possible. So an area where this has happened in my life very clearly was romance. For a long time, I couldn't truly be vulnerable with a woman because I was so afraid of what would happen if our relationship went sour, particularly if we were married. I was afraid of divorce because my parents had gotten divorced. And so I couldn't even get to the place where I was in the position to divorce, right? And so I would avoid that by never being vulnerable in the relationship, never letting the relationship mature and blossom. I would always make up some reason why this partner wasn't the woman for me. They weren't the one. And eventually the awakening happened, and the awakening was my realization with my fiance, Allison, that I am doing this. I am the one constantly making up reasons, literally fictionalizing reasons why my partner is not the one for me, in order that I sever the relationship and don't have to continue being vulnerable. And this, of course, was hard to face because it meant that as I looked back on my relationship history, I recognized that all of the rationalizations I had for why those previous partners weren't going to work, they were just that. They were rationalizations. And I had to realize I am doing this. I am making up this story, and I'm making up this story because I'm afraid. So that's the confrontation. That's the difficult emotional grappling. And from that comes the alternative or the empowerment or the possibility. I can do something different. I can open my heart. I can step into this relationship and see what happens. Of course, we never know what's going to happen. I think I'm going to be married to Allison for my entire life because of the love I feel for her and the compatibility we continually find together. But I don't know. I can never be sure of that. And so I will always live in that danger and uncertainty, the danger of heartbreak, of friction. But this new world is possible, this world of being together, being in romantic companionship, because of the awakening, because of my confrontation with my own noxious pattern, and from that, the relinquishment of that pattern and the possibility of something different, of a different world. And there are other examples. There are examples for me around exercise, drug use, eating, an unhealthy relationship to artistry and the identity of being a suffering artist, and sort of having it worse than others, carrying this burden that I needed to express through my art. There have been minor awakenings on all of these topics in order that I can release the unproductive pattern and step into something more desirable. So I just wanted to kind of introduce that framework of awakening, because over the past few days and week, I've experienced something like this with the death of George Floyd. And I don't really know why. I don't know why all of these other deaths and instances of brutality of mainly black men by police throughout my lifetime have been insufficient to produce that awakening. And suddenly, here it is. I have some ideas about why. As I expressed in my writing on Facebook, I think the quarantine for me has provided a new level of space and also some similarities to this kind of downtrodden experience, so that I, even an extremely privileged person, might be able to better feel it, better empathize with it than I ever was before. But these are just theories. I think our processes of awakening are always, in some sense, mysterious. They happen when they happen. And I think that fact helps me to forgive myself for something I've been feeling shame around, which is the rate of my awakening relative others. There are many people who have lived with this awareness for much longer than I have, or even their entire lives. Or we could speak of the awareness being passed down from generation to generation, the awareness of the suffering of the downtrodden. This is wrong. It must change. No one will listen to me. No one will help me. I'm called crazy for what I can see with my own two eyes. There have always been these kinds of oral storytelling and embodied traditions that conflict with dominant narratives. And I can feel frustrated with myself that it took me so long, for no reason I can discern, to be able to say the same thing. This is wrong, this must stop, and a different world is possible. A different choice is possible. One thing I do know is that being able to make statements like that comes from feeling something in my heart, in my core. It is an embodied form of understanding as opposed to a mental form of comprehension. Because my whole life I've been an open person, willing to listen as much as I am able to stories that conflict with my worldview, as I think is true of most people. It's not as though, well, there are exceptions. There are exceptions to this along my path of awakening. But I know that I've always tried to be as open as I can to narratives counter to my own. And yet, until the past few days, until the past week, these truths clicked for me in only a mental way. there wasn't the embodied feeling with which I can say, I too know in my core that this is wrong and that it must stop. So that's the kind of change that's come over me, and that's what I mean by awakening. I have a sense that this is a much wider phenomenon at this moment than just me. We can see it all throughout this country in the protests erupting in various cities. Some instances of violence, some instances of peaceful protest, and there are competing narratives at this moment about who's causing the violence, how much violence is appropriate, what it all means. It's really not my area to have an opinion. But I just bring this up to indicate, and we're seeing it on social media as well, that this is a collective as well as an individual awakening. Something about this moment is bringing the knowledge from the head down into the heart. And it's the heart that can know this is wrong, a different choice is possible. The head can only theorize from a distance. It can't commit. It can't stand in solidarity. And so an awakening is necessarily an embodied experience. Something else I want to say, which I suppose I've suggested earlier, is although this is a collective awakening, it's not a universal one. Again, there are people who've lived with this knowledge for generations. And an area where I have shame is that until now, I have not fully heard their stories. I've wanted to, but there was a barrier in me. And that's something I cannot change. And I look back on friendships I've had with people of different identities, and I see them in a different light. I see there were ways in which our friendships were always superficial because there were aspects of their experience into which I did not inquire. And again, I have to forgive myself. I was always doing the best I could, as most people are, with the knowledge I had. But I wish that I could have been more present for those people and their stories and their truths at that time. So I wanted to talk about awakening and this experience of coming into my body with this knowledge and the kind of commitment and the ability to make a statement that it engenders, and its mysterious quality, the fact that although we strive for awakening, we cannot control it. And I also wanted to talk about what, in my eyes, comes next. And again, mine is one opinion among many, and it is the opinion of someone not affected by this violence and who, for the majority of my life, has not lived in this fear. So take it or leave it. These are just some thoughts I have based on patterns of awakening that I've seen in my life and what generally follows. So once we recognize an unhealthy behavior, an unhealthy pattern that we want to let go of, and we want to live into a new, more fruitful story, we generally need counsel, community, and leadership. We need people to guide us through healing and proactivity in our lives. Or if not guide us through, at least be there with us during these processes for this trajectory. So with respect to race in this country, something obvious to me from my reading of history is that there has never been appropriate redress or compensation for the harms done to African Americans and other people in this country. And I think redress or recompense, which is a word I'm always afraid to say because I'm not sure I know what it means or that I can say it right. I think it is spiritual. I think it has to be spiritual and emotional as well as material. So, again, if you read the history, there have been numerous promises made to African Americans in particular for wrongs received, and those promises have fallen through. Same is true of Native Americans. These groups have been manipulated, lied to, enslaved, beaten, killed. And there have been moments in history where the largely white government has come forth and said, we're going to give these things to you as compensation for these wrongs. And it's never happened properly. And so there's that material level. The same would be true in a one-on-one relationship if you loaned someone money and they never paid it back to you, to use a really gross kind of comparison. Can there really be peace between you until that situation is addressed? Then there's also the spiritual and emotional level, which is simply acknowledging the pain and the stories and ceasing to try to wish them away out of my own discomfort or shame, and accepting my responsibility and my part in the creation of that pain, those stories. Accepting the situation, being there, being present to it as a witness and as someone seeking to make corrections. So there's the material and there's the emotional and spiritual levels, and I believe they are inextricably linked, that they are part of the same equation. And so I believe we need leaders who can draw us collectively through these processes of, for people like me, and the burden really does rest with us. It's not a, we're all in this together, we've all got to do it together. It's not really that kind of thing to me. We need leaders who can take people like me through the process of whatever material compensation needs to be made and whatever emotional and spiritual confrontation and recognition needs to be had. And I believe it is a collective enterprise. It is something so much larger than any individual, fraught with history and all sorts of choices unacknowledged till this moment. Or I speak for myself, that people like me have been unaware of till this moment. So I believe that kind of leadership is necessary. Sorry, there's a hair on my phone that I'm taking out. And I don't know who those leaders are. And I don't know what the calculations will confer about material payments or land being given back or housing or whatever will come from this. It's not my expertise, but there are people doing that work. And I believe it's a scientific and spiritual kind of work to see what will be just here. There's also something else, something related that arises for me as I say that, which is that people like myself need to accept that perhaps there is no way to redress what has been done. Perhaps the damage and the blindness have been too great. Sometimes in a relationship, you come together and you apologize for something you did in the past and you try to make things right. And the other person can accept your apology and your intention, and it still may not be appropriate for you to continue as friends, continue in relationship in whatever form. Sorry, I got a text message. Yeah, so that's something we need to accept as well. That, for instance, separatists like Malcolm X may be correct in the end, or may present the most healthful alternative, at least for a segment of the population, and it's not personal. It's not about us. It's something we need to accept. The other thing I wanted to say about this notion of leadership and these collective grief and acknowledgement and processes and attempts to rectify is that they may be carried out in more distributive fashion as well. What I'm envisioning is leadership at the national level, really empowered spiritual teachers and mathematicians. And obviously, as a white person, I don't believe I'm one of these leaders. I'm just envisioning such a thing, hoping for such a thing. People who can captivate and lead us as a nation through this process. But it may be that in a media and cultural landscape as fragmented and diversified as we have, this process will be more distributed. It will be more local communities, one-on-one, small groups, and leaders at that level. And perhaps the reason I can't think of national leaders capable of serving in this role at this moment is that they are no longer needed, given how our media and culture have changed. Perhaps the change can take place in this quieter, more distributed form. I don't know. I long for leadership of the kind that I've been mythologizing here. So, just some thoughts on personal awakenings, shame we may feel around their lateness, forgiving ourselves for that fact and recognizing that in the scheme of things, there is no too late. There is rather the absolutely precious quality of all awakening. Portending that after awakening comes leadership and healing and intention setting, which is always a collective process. It's not something we can do alone. I owe a great debt to every therapist I've had, every spiritual teacher, every friend who has echoed back my thoughts and feelings around difficult issues, and I believe we need that as a nation. And then lastly, in this video, I have discussed the possibility that this process is already in motion, already meeting itself out in a less salient and more distributed fashion, by which I mean at the local level, amongst people like us having the conversations we are already having. That may be the nature of this time. I wanted to say one final thing before signing this off. A lot of what I've discussed in this video is emotional and may sound vague to some minds. I've talked about hearing stories and knowing them to be true. I've talked about oral traditions, which have always carried counter-hegemonic narratives. If you don't know the word hegemonic, look it up. It's very useful to describe a slew of things. I've talked about how narratives can click for us either in the mind or deeper in our heart and core, and the power of commitment and solidarity that comes from the second of these locations. And listening to this, you may be the type of person who responds, well, none of what you're saying is true statistically. And you may be drawn to pull out statistics that show that murders of Black citizens by the police are not as common as reported, that it's all media hype, or, well, Blacks commit crimes at higher rates, or all these sorts of narratives that hold up a certain form of truth in order to quiet the other. And I want to invite consideration of two things, if you are that type of person. One is that what you are resisting may be the shame of confrontation, the shame that precedes authentic awakening, where you recognize the choice you have been unknowingly making and own that really was a choice all along, which then enables you to make a different choice. But there first has to be that moment of, oh, this is something I've been doing, and it has been ushering in a bleaker, more dangerous, more hazardous world. This shame, it's dawned on me in the last week, is something I have always experienced in interactions with people of color. Even in the most minute encounters, walking by someone on the street, nodding my head, maybe smiling, maybe the smile is reciprocated, maybe it's not. I think deep down there's a sense, even though I was born into this world, even though I am not directly responsible for some of the hardship that this person has suffered, I am complicit in it. My every waking moment is a choice to sustain it or not. And the shame of that is something I have always carried. And if you're a person who wields statistics to silence narratives like the ones I've been discussing in this video, I want to invite you to consider that a world is possible in which you need not carry that shame. That world will be won through difficult confrontations and awarenesses and conversations and collective action to bring about something better. But a world is possible where your happiness can feel authentic and not weighted down with shame over the suffering of others. And it is the world for which I'll be fighting with so many others for the rest of my life. And I hope that you can join us. I'd like to end on that positive note, but there was one other thing I wanted to share with a person of this type, the person who is drawn to statistics to counter narratives of pain. I want to invite you to consider that statistical truth-telling is itself a cultural product. In other words, it cannot claim to be objective in a way that other forms of truth-telling are not. Statistical truth-telling was invented by largely white men in European and American culture. It is a product of Western science, which is not the only form of recording or responding to data. And as a result of this, there have always been suppressed and hushed forms of truth-telling that take place behind closed doors. Think of the phrase wives' tales. Lots of these, by the way, have now been scientifically verified. Think about indigenous ways of interacting with the land, things like rain dances, prayers to gods for bountiful harvests. Think of people like so-called witches, people who've believed in magic and been called crazy, and in many cases killed for centuries for beliefs that were counter to the dominant system. There have always been these alternative forms of truth-telling, and I simply want to introduce the idea that things like statistics are but one among many ways of conveying truths. And with that notion, I hope you can get curious instead of defensive about hearing what someone else brings up that you may not have considered before, that may sound foreign to you. I hope you can ask yourself, the data I've seen doesn't seem to support this, doesn't seem to jive with this, but I wonder what kinds of data I don't know how to see, and whether I can learn to see those. I did a video a while ago called "What Does It Mean to Believe in Ghosts?" And it was really about how whether or not we believe in ghosts is a political choice. What a ghost is something someone else sees that I do not. How confident am I that what I see is absolute reality? That in itself is a political question. So again, if you are doubtful of the kinds of narratives you're seeing on Facebook or on other media, I simply want to invite humility about the truth itself. It's something I try to practice, and I've always tried to practice. And it's difficult for me, as I believe it is for most other people. So, thank you if you've listened to this, and I hope you have a blessed day, and I know that we can bring about a more beautiful and safer and equitable world for all. Thank you.